if you're listening to this on the day it drops, today's date is May 31st, 2026. And if you've been tracking the math with me, you know exactly what today is. It's day 1000. 1000 consecutive days of sitting down, logging on, and pulling back the curtain and writing my way through a total life reconstruction. You know, when I first started this countdown, 1,000 days seemed like some mythical, impossible horizon. It felt like a number you hit and suddenly a bell rings, a banner drops, and you're handed a certificate that says, "Congratulations, you are now officially healed." But there are no banners in the driveway at 5 a.m. A lot of people hit milestones like this and they want to show you the highlight reel. They want to give you the glitz. They want to stand on the podium and tell you how easy it is if you just follow a few simple steps like they did. But you know how I function. You know the motto of this show: no glitz, just the work. So today, I'm not giving you a victory lap. I'm giving you a diagnostic report. Because hitting 1,000 days didn't mean arriving at some perfect, flawless destination. It meant I stayed alive and stayed consistent long enough to look back at the blueprint of my own collapse and finally understand how the machinery works. I've spent the last few weeks, months really, interrogating myself. I've gone deeper into my own history, my own mistakes, and my relationship patterns than I ever thought possible. As I stand here on day 1000, looking back at the wreckage I crawled out of and the foundation I've poured since, it all boils down to 4 distinct lessons. 4 hard-fought, unshakable pillars that didn't just help me survive the last 3.5 years. They helped me redefine who I am. They turned me from a guy who was just passively enduring the misery into the man you see standing before you today, Rob of 1,000 Days. Let's start with the first one. Let's talk about the sovereignty of choosing yourself. The first lesson, or the first pillar, if you will, from the trenches, is about choice. When everything falls apart, the world loves to present you with 2 default options. Option A is usually the path of quiet desperation. You stay in the wreckage, you tolerate the misery, you play the victim, and you keep running on the same miserable hamster wheel because it feels safe. Option B is a panic button. You run away blindly, you jump into the very next relationship, the next distraction, or the next vice just to numb the pain. For a long time I thought those were my only choices, and historically, because of how I'm wired, I chose to stay in the wreckage. Let's face it, for most of my life I've been the nice guy. That is a mold that I am actively trying to break. Because there is a massive difference between being a nice guy and being a good guy. Too often, because I was trying to be nice, trying to be the dutiful son or the devoted partner, I stuck with things long past their expiration date. You could say I've ridden the Titanic straight to the bottom of the ocean more than once. But when your self-esteem is low, it is an incredibly hard habit to break. You're just so damn grateful that someone is giving you a little bit of attention that you stay, because you're terrified that if you walk away, you'll never experience that again. But over the last 1,000 days, I've discovered something liberating. You don't have to accept the defaults. There is a sovereignty in realizing that you can choose option C. If option C is pulling the trigger on a bad situation, it requires you to set a brand new standard for what you allow into your life. Because option C isn't just about walking away. It is fundamentally about choosing yourself. You know, the first time I really pulled the trigger was initiating the end of a certain relationship in my life. Maybe that's because of what I went through with my divorce from X1 and then my breakup later on with X2. But I've changed. Call it jaded, call it guarded, or maybe just call it mature. But I've realized that relationships aren't always what they're cracked up to be. I've been there. I've done that. Hell, I've got the kids to prove it. But here's the secret about option C. Confidence is built on a string of victories. Once you choose option C just one time, once you step off the ship, choose yourself, and understand that you aren't going to die of loneliness or neglect, you realize that you can survive anything. That's why walking away from X2, while painful, was a hell of a lot easier than my divorce from X1. Choosing option C, choosing yourself, isn't about being selfish. It's about taking care of yourself so that you are actually capable of being there for the people who matter. It's about securing your own sanity so you can get out of bed tomorrow morning. I am no good to my kids. I'm no good to any of my loved ones if I am miserable, broken, and useless. You know, the amazing thing about option C is that once you claim that sovereignty, you change. You become stronger. You walk taller. You lift your head a little bit higher when you face the world. In the past, I thought surviving meant enduring the misery. Now I know that choosing myself is the only thing that actually makes me feel alive. And that brand new standard, that's where the 100% policy comes in. That's the second pillar. A policy I had to write in my own blood over the last 1,000 days. When you start a rebuild, you're fragile. Your ego is bruised. Your foundation is cracked, and you're starving for validation. And when you're starving, you will accept crumbs. A text message every 3 weeks from someone who claims to care. A half-hearted commitment. A situation where you are constantly left guessing where you stand, settling for the bare minimum just to be seen. For a long time, I took the crumbs. I thought, well, a little bit of something is better than a whole lot of nothing. I was wrong. Crumbs don't keep you alive. In fact, when you're starving, crumbs are just enough to make you even more hungry. Let me give you a real-world example of what this looks like, because this isn't just some abstract philosophy. A while back, I met a woman on a dating app. I'll call her XST. She worked in a school office. We went out a few times, and it was this constant loop. We'd talk, we'd go out once or twice, and then she would just fall off the face of the earth. A few months would pass, she'd resurface, and we would do it again. Recently, we've been talking a bit more. We actually have some common ground right now. She's navigating some heavy stuff with her dad's health, and I'm right there in the trenches dealing with my mom in assisted living. So there is a human connection there. But I finally decided to put my cards on the table. I asked her about the disappearing acts, and she looked at me and was honest. She told me that the first few times we went out, she just wasn't really feeling the spark. Now, I'll be honest with you, that hurt a bit to hear. But the truth is, if I'm being completely honest with myself, I felt it too. I knew the alignment wasn't there. But because I still found her incredibly attractive, and yeah, she's a great kisser, I was willing to tolerate the stop and start. But here's where the 100% policy kicks in. And this is the shift that 1,000 days gives you. I don't blame her. I don't hold a grudge against XST at all. She's allowed to not feel a spark. But if someone is willing to explicitly tell you that they aren't that into you, why the hell would you spend another second wasting your time or getting yourself emotionally beat up trying to change their mind? This policy isn't about chasing girls or being bitter. It's about recognizing that you only have a finite amount of emotional capital to spend. Why throw it into some black hole? If it isn't reciprocal, clear, 100% investment from both sides, the transaction is over. You pull the plug, you choose option C, and you walk away. But let's be real about what that actually looks like in practice. Because a lot of people mistake a boundary for an ultimatum. They think it's like saying, if you don't do this, I'm going to leave. But here's the problem with those kinds of ultimatums. If you're going to say it, if you're going to put yourself out on that kind of a limb, then you better be damn sure you're ready to follow through with it. Because if you bluff on your own boundaries, you are finished. You're just teaching people how much they can get away with. And that's the hardest part of this 3.5-year journey. It is incredibly painful to hold the line when every codependent, lonely part of your brain is screaming at you to just compromise, to just accept the breadcrumbs because it's easier than standing alone. But if you're going to commit to a rebuild, you have to be all in. No half measures, no bluffing. When you decide your time and your peace are worth 100%, you have to be willing to actually close the book, walk out the door, and never look back. Let's talk about the tween years, that awkward liminal space between where you used to be and where you're going. Now, in Pillar 2, I talked about knowing when to walk away, but 1,000 Days of Data teaches you that not every situation calls for a hard exit. Sometimes it calls for a slowdown. For a long time, I thought rebuilding meant sprinting, but over the last 1,000 days, I've had to learn the agonizing, beautiful art of moving slowly. That's Pillar 3. Early on, I even did a whole podcast episode on this concept, leaning into that timeless Martin Luther King Jr. quote, "If you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. And if you can't walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, you have to keep moving forward." And that's the definition I clung to. For a long time, I intentionally wanted to take things slow in my personal life, especially on the romantic front. I knew my past pattern was to sprint into relationships far too quickly, and I wanted to do it differently this time. But 1,000 Days of Data teaches you how to read the fine print of your own life. And lately I've realized that I was getting tripped up on my own philosophy. I had to face a hard truth. There is a massive difference between moving slowly and being completely inert. A merry-go-round has plenty of motions. It spins, it takes effort, and it feels like a journey. Whee! It's awesome when you're little. But one day you grow up and you realize that you're just going in circles, landing exactly where you started. That isn't a slow walk forward. That is high-speed stagnation. Recently, I realized the dynamic in my own life had become exactly that, a merry-go-round, and I had to step off the ride, lay my cards flat on the table, and have that quiet, direct conversation where I stopped pretending that the loop was enough. In the past, I would have been the one avoiding the heavy stuff. I would have been the one finding a punchline or a distraction to divert from the uncomfortable conversation, content to just stay on the ride. But somewhere along this road, the work changed me. I became the person who was deliberate. I became the one willing to stop the spin and ask where the hell things are actually going. The art of moving slowly only works if you're actually moving forward. Drawing that boundary, stopping the loop, and sitting in the quiet while the dust settles, that isn't rushing. That is the ultimate act of deliberate, patient progress. When you spend 1,000 days rebuilding, you spend a lot of time looking backward to see how far you've come, or looking down to make sure your feet are hitting the pavement. But eventually, you have to look up. You have to look toward the horizon. For me, that is the audacity of potential. Pillar 4. It's the sheer courage required to look at a blank slate and ask, what if? What if the next chapter isn't about surviving the wreckage, but designing something entirely new? I'm reminded of that famous line popularized by Robert F. Kennedy when he said, "Some men see things as they are, and they say why. I dream of things that never were, and say, why not?" To me, that is the ultimate definition of potential. It's a refusal to let the current landscape dictate the rest of the story. Now, I've written before about what I call the tricorder perspective. On Star Trek, a tricorder is a tool used to scan an unknown environment, to gather data, and help the crew navigate the final frontier. That's what modern tools, reflection, and this very archive have been for me. I'm using them to scan my life, measure my growth, and chart a course into an unexplored future. But a tool is only as good as the person holding it. You can look at the tricorder data and see exactly why things are the way they are, but it takes something else entirely to look at that same data, look out into the unknown, and ask, why not? You can have all the data in the world, but if you don't have the audacity to believe that what comes next can be bigger, better, and entirely your own design, then you'll stay anchored to the past. The triple digits are over. The horizon is here, and I am walking toward it with my eyes wide open. Which brings us to the end of Season 2, and it brings us to day 1000. I've been asked a lot lately what happens next. People want to know where the blog goes from here, and what Season 3 of this podcast looks like, or if hitting this milestone means that I'm finally going to pack it in, take a bow, and stop writing. And to be completely honest with you, I don't have the whole roadmap figured out yet. I've got a couple of ideas cooking in the basement, but no set schematic. But there's a famous scene in The Wolf of Wall Street where Jordan Belfort, as played by Leonardo DiCaprio, stands in front of his entire company under a mountain of pressure from the federal government. He grabs a microphone and he yells to the room, "I'm not fucking leaving!" That's where I'm at. I am not going anywhere. 3.5 years ago, I started rebuilding a life from scratch. On May 31st, which is today, by the way, the countdown officially hits 0. The foundation is completely poured and the concrete is set. But day 1001 starts the very next morning. The work doesn't stop just because the numbers change. Now, if you've been on this road with me, head over to rebuildingrob.com, subscribe, and stay tuned, because the training wheels are officially coming off. Season 3 is coming. No glitz, just the work. I'm Rob. Good night. This episode of Rebuilding Rob, the podcast, was produced, edited, written, and hosted by yours truly, your favorite blogger, a guy named Rob. I'd like to thank you for tuning in to today's episode. I'm well aware that, like me, you have a ton of podcast listening options, so I'm honored that you decided to take a little bit of your time out of your day to spend here with me. Rebuilding Rob, the podcast, is available wherever you find your favorite podcast. Of course, you probably figured that part out already, or else you wouldn't be listening to me right now. If you're interested in more insight into this perfectly ordinary, non-gun-owning white guy, feel free to check out my blog, rebuildingrob.com. So until next time, this is Rob, reminding you to be audacious, be bold, be brave, be strong enough to be gentle, and remember, the rebuild never ends. Bye, everybody.